So there's a lot on social media about my story, and it's mostly true. I grew up in the States, but my dad is Ghanaian. I traveled back and forth from Accra to the States for holidays, etc. But I didn't start living in Ghana until 2017. I was a teaching fellow at the MEST Meltwater School incubator. So it was a incubator for entrepreneurs who wanted to start businesses and needed a little more support and training and funding. And I was teaching business and go-to-market analysis, etc. It was while I was at MEST that I came up with the idea for Jetstream along with my co-founder, Solomon Togbor, who had been working for the Maersk shipping line for about 8 years when we co-founded Jetstream. When I was teaching at MEST, I had sort of a side hustle, an export business that I was building for natural products. And I had been able to get my products into the local sort of middle-class shopping mall in Accra, near where MEST is located. But I was excited to scale up, and I knew that there was no better place to do that than the biggest market in Africa, and that's Lagos. So I took a plane to Lagos with a suitcase full of my products. And as soon as I got to the city, I went to an open air market in Ikeja, where there were a lot of beauty salons and, places where I could just walk in and pitch my products. I sold out I had a sort of a coconut oil product. I sold out of my entire suitcase within about 2 or 3 hours. And I was just shocked by how fast commerce works in Lagos, and I was excited. But I had a big challenge because I didn't know how to move those products from Accra, where I was manufacturing them, to Lagos, where I knew I wanted to sell them, without physically going with them on a plane. So I talked to Solomon, who I already knew, and asked him what my options were. And he told me that there were very few options for cross-border trade, especially within Africa, for SMEs. I could either use a courier like DHL or FedEx, who would charge me, 5 times more on logistics, the transport costs, than my products were actually worth. And that didn't make sense. Or I could build my own supply chain. I could find a truck driver that was willing to go from Accra through Benin, through Togo into Nigeria. I could find customs brokers at the Accra, the Ghana border, the Togo border, the Benin border, the Nigerian border. I could find warehouse operators, and I would have to find some way of personally monitoring all of those people, paying them in 3 different currencies, communicating with them in 2 different languages. And that's really difficult for an SME to do, and it's cost prohibitive. So it dawned on me when Solomon shed light on the fragmentation of the supply chain and how it blocks companies from scaling across borders in Africa. It dawned on me that I would make a bigger impact on economic development and commerce in Africa if he and I could focus on building supply chains like pipes and selling access to those supply chains rather than trying to build products and not being able to distribute. So I think that there are 3 big trends, and the first one was triggered by COVID. So during the COVID crisis, chains globally were melting down, which means that countries like the United States, which used to have no problem importing from places like China, were seeing inventory stockouts, product unavailability. The reality that we live with in Ghana and that you see in many places in sub-Saharan Africa, where inventory is volatile, you never know when your product is going to get there, that's our normal. But during COVID, that normal became everyone's normal. And that caused a lot of manufacturers and retailers, big companies like Walmart, like the big retailers in the West, to reassess their supply chains. And what they found was that they were too concentrated in certain regions, which exposed them to the problems that they saw in during COVID. So post-COVID, you see a lot of effort companies are putting into diversifying their supply chains, which means changing the actual suppliers and the actual regions that they pull from. A lot of the supply chains are moving from China into Southeast Asia, like places like Vietnam. Some of them are moving into India and South America and Central America. The second big change that you're seeing is an increased focus on visibility. So just the understanding of who has your cargo at any given point, but also what the ingredients are in that, in the goods that you're buying. So if you're a food manufacturer, having a lot of precise knowledge about the temperature of all of those ingredients, the origin of all those ingredients, and the labor record and the carbon footprint of your supply chain. So the standard of sort of visibility has gone up, almost, it's more than 10x. It's almost hard to quantify how much it's gone up. It used to not be important at all to know who your second or third tier suppliers are. Now it's a requirement in some jurisdictions in the West. The second big change that we're seeing is this, and this is mostly happening in Africa, is this integration of financing and logistics. We were really on the forefront of pioneering a hybrid, like integrated product where we work with banks to pre-finance imports and exports, not just the freight, not just the ocean freight or the air freight, but actually the goods. So we're helping exporters buy inputs so they can complete purchase orders and ship to buyers around the world. We're helping importers pay customs duties and buy goods. That collaboration between logistics companies and the banks, it was very rare before COVID, and we started introducing a bundled product of both logistics and financing in 2021. And since then, it's just exploded. And we've seen people in other logistics sectors, not just the cross-border sector, use the same formula of financing and logistics together. I don't really have any big regrets. I think that there were times where I sort of intuitively knew that a certain person was not going to be a good hire, or a certain decision was too early or too late. Those are specific times in my, especially the first 2 years of Jetstream, where I wasn't trusting my gut, and I was sort of saying, well, we need to find the data. I want to be a data-driven manager. The reality is, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's so little data. If you forestall a decision because you don't have enough data to make it, you will never get anywhere as an entrepreneur. We were lucky, and I think my co-founder complements my skill set. He moves very quickly. He's extremely agile. And we were able to grow quickly, in part because of the two complementary personalities. But what I learned from him and learned from experience is that almost 100% of the time, where I knew in my gut that a decision had to be made and I didn't yet have the data, I could have made that decision correctly based on my gut rather than waiting for the data to become available. Now, Jetstream has generated its own internal data. So we have data about trade flows. We have data about employee performance. We have data about which types of team members do well at the company. We have data about which types of investors are a better fit for the company. So we have a lot more data than we had when we started. But the lesson for me over the long term has been to trust my judgment. I have to say I have pretty good entrepreneurial judgment. My instincts are normally right. And so I am always making sure to keep myself honest by having a diverse management team with people who disagree with me and making sure we're always looking at the numbers. But fundamentally, there are so many times in the past where we didn't have the data because of where we are, and just my instincts about when we should enter a market, who we should hire, which investors we should go after. Those instincts were correct. Advice I would give really to anyone who's frustrated where they are is to change your location, change the environment and the people you're around. So many of the barriers that we encounter as women are sort of embedded in our minds. And that's how I think sort of, if you want to call it quote unquote patriarchy or sort of existing structures, that's how I think they're the most effective. There are certainly women across Africa who are physically stopped from going to school. They're physically restrained from pursuing their dreams. But I think the more pervasive problem is the psychological barriers that we've sort of absorbed. And in my experience, the best way to break out of those psychological barriers, which involves whether it's self-doubt or, endless criticism or questioning or lack of support or lack of champions, all of that can be changed if you change your location and you change the people you're around. I think that's very hard to do sometimes because we come from communities where we have reciprocal relationships with people. It's not easy to leave your community. But if you believe that you have grown up and you're ready to sort of spread your wings, in many cases, you may need to leave the place where you are and find a new environment where you're going to find people who are like you, whether it's based on gender or it's based on your interest. You're going to find champions who support you. Just change your location.